Excuse me. Luba, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Trudy. Good afternoon and welcome everybody across the United States. I'm Suba Sadi. I'm a volunteer community ambassador with ARP here in Northern Virginia. From our earliest beginnings, ARP has championed lifelong learning. That's why ARP Virginia is thrilled to bring you our fourth year of Tuesday Explorers, a lifelong learning program offered every Tuesday from January through the end of April, but this time it'll actually go next week. I'll talk more about it in my concluding remarks at 3 o'clock Eastern Time for Curious Explorers. For more than 60 years, ARP has been a wise friend and fierce defender, helping individuals to ensure that their money, health, and happiness live as long as they do. ARP has earned a reputation as a wise friend and fierce defender through trusted information, tools, and advocacy designed to protect the health and financial security of older Americans and empower them to choose how they live as they age. By promising to act as a wise friend and fierce defender, ARP is helping people who are 50 plus and their families feel confident, in control, and secure as they age. As a wise friend in your corner, ARP helps you protect yourself and your loved ones from fraud, get healthy and stay healthy, care for loved ones, make connections, plan a trip, learn new technologies, attend a class, and have fun while you're learning, like what we're going to do today with our Tuesday Explorers program. I hope you will continue to take advantage of these opportunities and more. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dave Mattingly. Let me tell you folks a little bit about him. Dave Mattingly entered the Navy in 1973 after completing recruit and photographic intelligence man training. He reported to his first command. In June 1974, he reported to the only foreign home-ported aircraft carrier, USS Midway, CV-41, and was assigned to the Carrier Intelligence Center, CVIC. In CVIC, he served as a photo interpreter, reports officer, and mission planning analyst. In 1975, the USS Midway participated in Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation of U.S. citizens and refugees from Saigon. He left USS Midway in 1977 and reported to the Naval Intelligence Command. During his career, he has served in numerous posts. As a fellow veteran, Dave, thank you for your service, and the floor is yours, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Mattingly, and I'm a docent here at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. I'm also a Cold War veteran. I served in the U.S. Navy from '73 until 2005, and I was stationed on board the USS Midway during the evacuation of Saigon in '75. We will discuss this evacuation later in this presentation. Now join me in the first gallery space. If you've attended one of our virtual programs or visited our museum in the past, you might be familiar with some of these artifacts, but I want to set the stage before we move on to our Cold War exhibits. What you can see here is the Leatherneck Gallery. That is our big entrance and introduction to the museum. In this gallery, we are proud to display a variety of macro artifacts, including 5 aircraft hanging from our ceiling. A Curtiss Jenny airplane from the 1920s, 2 Corsair fighters from World War II. The motto of Corsair you see here is from the Korean War, and an SBD Dauntless dive bomber from World War II, and also an AV-8B Harrier jump jet from the 1980s to the later Cold War years. On the ground, we feature an LVT-1 amphibious tractor and a vignette from World War II, and a Vietnam-era Sikorsky UH-34D helicopter. The macro artifacts in this gallery demonstrate the core values of what it means to be a Marine and brings to mind feelings of courage, determination, compassion, innovation, and the tight bonds that are formed between Marines. During this program, we will be highlighting some of the most significant Cold War events of the Marine Corps that are exhibited here at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. Although there were significant events that occurred all over the world during this time period, we will focus primarily on the Korean War and Vietnam War in those galleries. And while we could spend hours talking about just one battle during either of these two wars, we will discuss some of the key moments of both conflicts. To begin, it's essential to understand some background information about what we will be discussing. Historians note that the time period of the Cold War started with the end of World War II in 1945 and lingered until it was officially labeled over in 1989. Many regard the Cold War as one of the most dangerous periods in history. As World War II ended, the United States Marine Corps was recognized as the world's preeminent amphibious force. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, after observing the fighting on Iwo Jima, asserted, "The raising of that flag on Mount Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. However, with the use of nuclear weapons to bring about the end of World War II, many strategists argued that land armies would no longer have a place on future battlefields. Moreover, President Harry Truman, an Army veteran of World War I, considered the Marines to be the Navy's police force and nothing more. The Marine Corps was slated to be reorganized with 1/3 fewer Marines. However, there was a significant shift in the Marine Corps that Truman was responsible for. Specifically, we discussed the role he played in the desegregation of the armed forces, which mixed all races within their units. In World War II, units with all African American Marines had more than proven themselves in battle with their courage and dedication. In response, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which officially ended segregation in the Marine Corps and other branches of the military. In 1948, Truman was also responsible for the opening, the enlistment, commissioning of women into the regular Marine Corps. Here you can see your museum's exhibit of women who served in Korea. Let's back up a bit. After World War II, meetings were held between the Allies to determine the post-war future of Europe. The countries that aligned with the United States would be divided from those that the Soviet Union occupied. Germany and its capital city, Berlin, were divided between the Allies. In Asia, the Korean Peninsula was divided. The United States occupied the South and the Soviet Union the North. But around the world, there was unrest. There was a civil war in China. The Marines were supervising the withdrawal of Japanese troops from China, and France was trying to maintain control of their colony, Indochina, now known as Vietnam. In 1961, the construction of the Berlin Wall was completed. This wall and the Warsaw Pact was designed to maintain control of the Eastern European countries. In the United States, working on lessons learned from World War II, Congress reorganized the military to confront an emerging communist threat. While the Soviet Union occupied the northern portion of the Korean Peninsula, it trained and equipped a new North Korean People's Army. Before we go on, I would like to show you the entrance of our Korean War gallery, which you see a little bit behind me. The start of this gallery puts us at a classroom display. Through a voiceover, a 1950s classroom teacher explains the complicated politics of the time period to her classroom. As we see images and reels of events from around the world, we also learn why the Marines are in South Korea. This allows the stage to be set for events we will see in the rest of the gallery. In the classroom display at the entrance to the gallery, we learn that on June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army pushed the small U.S. garrison and South Korean Army into an area around the southern port city of Pusan, which came to be known as the Pusan Perimeter. Before this invasion, the United States had withdrawn most of its troops from Korea, leaving only a small training detachment of U.S. Army soldiers. The South Korean Army was more of an internal security force than an army capable of defending its borders. After the invasion by North Korea, the United Nations Security Council, without the presence of the Soviet Union delegates, voted to authorize a UN military force to defend South Korea or the Republic of Korea. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed the commander of United Nations forces sent to Korea. Needing reinforcements to hold the battle lines around Pusan, General MacArthur requested support from the Marine Corps. The Marines landed a small contingent, which immediately went into combat. Needing additional forces, MacArthur requested more Marines, and President Truman authorized the recall of the reserves. Many of those recalled to duty included World War II veterans and Marines who had not yet completed boot camp. Without a great deal of planning or training, MacArthur decided to launch an amphibious landing at Incheon, a seaport on the northwest coast of Korea. This seaport would enable the landing force to catch the enemy off guard and move towards the capital city of Seoul, freeing it from the occupation by North Korea and cutting off North Korea's supply lines. When the Marines learned of MacArthur's intentions to land at Incheon Harbor, they argued that even the best amphibious forces needed more training before attempting this complex amphibious landing. With little additional training, the Marines deployed from California on World War II-era amphibious ships to Korea. The Marines sailed into Incheon Harbor in September 1950 and encountered all the problems previously identified during the short planning period. At low tide, the mud flats were exposed, which made it difficult to transport the Marines near the shore. Additionally, the Marines encountered seawalls that they had to climb by using makeshift ladders. This battle caused the Navy Marine Corps team to use training in the mantra, improvise, adapt, and overcome. To give you a small impression of what this endeavor looked like, our museum has a section showing a perspective of the landing. Visitors can stand here and see and hear examples of the planning leading up to this landing. The man you see here at the top of the seawall is First Lieutenant Baldormo Lopez, who was the first to climb over and put himself in harm's way to lead his Marines. He would receive the Medal of Honor posthumously for his sacrifice during this battle, when he used his body to smother a hand grenade thrown by the enemy. The Marines that landed faced a lighter enemy force than expected and quickly moved through the city. However, in Seoul, they faced strong resistance and urban fighting, which they were not trained for. This gallery image shows an M26 Pershing tank that was used to take control of the city. MacArthur had wanted to secure the city and turn it over to South Korean President Syngman Rhee, even though the Marines were engaged in close urban combat just blocks from the ceremony. Securing the city, the Marines then convoyed around the peninsula for their next assignment. After retaking Seoul, Army General Edward Almond and General MacArthur considered a run to the eastern side of Korea toward the Chinese-Korean border as a final plunge to rout the North Korean army. The Marines landed unopposed at Wonsan and began moving through the mountainous terrain toward the Chinese border. Along the march, the Marines and Army faced brutally cold weather conditions, with temperatures as low as 50 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The cold not only affected the Marines, but also their weapons. The Marines neared the Yalu River in the border with China, where they encountered Chinese soldiers. Soon, they were vastly outnumbered by communist Chinese troops. The Marines were facing one of the coldest Korean winters in 50 years, surrounded by Chinese and North Korean troops at the Chosin Reservoir. They were also at a disadvantage logistically, trapped in the bow of the reservoir with the enemy in the high ground above them. Marines and soldiers were under a near constant barrage. Next, what you will hear is our section of the gallery where we show the men and a fraction of what they experienced.
Even the damn sleeping bag won't warm me up.
You don't want that around your legs anyway if they get inside the perimeter again.
Well, those 105s Artie is keeping in from Haggeroo will make them keep their heads down a few minutes.
God bless them. All right, what have we got left?
Well, this is it, half a box.
We should have a phone.
What you heard in the video is a representation of our gallery. The voiceover and the sound effects are meant to mimic the dark, cold, and nerve-wracking conditions the Marines faced in this battle as they waited for more supplies and reinforcements. At one point, they requested more mortar ammunition using the code word Tootsie Rolls. There was an error in the code and they were sent literally pallets of Tootsie Roll candies instead of the ammunition that they needed. Going back to the beginning of our gallery, you may have noticed a display case with a Chosin Marine where we have a Tootsie Roll wrapper in the case. To a casual guess, they might think it was a piece of trash, but it isn't. Although it wasn't the ammo they needed, they put the candy to good use. Not only was it a good source of energy, but the Marines could chew it to warm it up, then use it as a type of putty to plug up bullet holes in some of their equipment. Finally, they were told to withdraw, and as the Marines moved south towards the Navy ships waiting to pick them up, the Marines were joined by Army stragglers. When a reporter asked if the Marines were retreating, Marine Corps General O.P. Smith responded, "Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating, we're just advancing in a different direction." By ordering troops to the Chinese border, MacArthur violated orders given to him by President Truman, and MacArthur was soon relieved of duty. Chosin Reservoir would become one of the most noted battles of the Korean conflict. United Nations and the North Korean forces moved to a stalemate until the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed and a demilitarized zone was established on July 27, 1953. The armistice brought the end to a brief conflict that has had lasting effects on the world. But the Korean War also proved once again the necessity of the Marine Corps' existence, its ability to respond to international crises, and how the Marine Corps would still be needed in future conflicts. I want to add that when I visited the port of Busan in 1974, I was surprised to see that the port city still had machine gun nests and barbed wire surrounding the port, and throughout the city, you got a feeling that the war was still ongoing. Now I'd like to shift your attention to our Vietnam War gallery. At the entrance, you see a South Vietnamese Marine and a U.S. Marine training together, along with more context of what was happening in the world at this time, along with images of Vietnamese people and information on what the world was like when the Marines were sent to Vietnam. After Korea, the attention of the United States shifted to Vietnam as Ho Chi Minh's communist forces forced the surrender of the French army at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, which you see in this image here. The Geneva Accords of 1954 divided Vietnam with the communist government in the north and the democratic government in the south. In 1956, the government of the Republic of Vietnam in the South was formed. At the 17th parallel, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, was formed as a zone of separation. The U.S. worked to train a new South Vietnamese Marine Corps. In addition to training Vietnamese Marines in Vietnam, Vietnamese Marine officers also attended the Marine Corps Basic School, which is located right across the street from the museum at Quantico, Virginia. This helped to develop a cadre of officers skilled in operating with U.S. Marine Corps units. And here again is the example of the South Vietnamese Marine and a U.S. Marine training together in the display case at the start of our gallery. The military found that embedding U.S. Marines into the local Vietnamese villages, the villages were less likely to be influenced by the Viet Cong. In 1962, the increased size and offensive operation of Viet Cong against the Republic of Vietnam resulted in the deployment of small units from the U.S. Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps. The mission shifted for most of the troops from being advisors to combat support. The year 1962 would stand out in Marine Corps history for its deployment of Marine helicopters and crews to augment 3 Army helicopter squadrons already in Vietnam for a period of 60 to 90 days. This image here shows the museum's Leatherneck Gallery, where we have a fully restored Vietnam-era Sikorsky UH-34D helicopter that was restored by volunteer Marine Corps Vietnam veterans, who then donated the Sikorsky to the museum. Helicopters played a significant role during the war, which can be seen in our Vietnam gallery as well. The Marines were deployed to a former Japanese air base at Sac Trang in the Mekong Delta, which you can see in this map here. This mission was to support Republic of Vietnam Marines in Army combat operations. Now we'll transition further into the gallery. Like you have seen, in each gallery, we provide some immersive parts to bring this history to life. And for this gallery, we know exactly what area our guests interact with the most. If you're able to, please look around at this image and see if you can find the section of the gallery that you think guests interact with the most. If you think you know the answer, type it into the chat and what part of this gallery you think gets the most interaction. I will take a pause to give everyone a chance to look at this image and take a guess, but I would like to draw your attention to certain parts. For example, here we commemorate the war dogs who served with the Marines. And if you look over to the side, you can see a Marine searching for Viet Cong tunnels over by this hut. If you look at this scene from the other side, you can look up and see a chicken on the roof of this replicated hut. As a hint, I would like you to take a close look at the floor in this gallery. Are you guessing? All right. Thank
They
you.
are guessing, they're guessing the tunnels and the basket.
Ah, interesting. Well, some of you may have noticed the section of the floor with a piece of clear glass. And if you guessed that this was the section to get the most attention, you would be right. This section shows an example of a booby trap with punji sticks. When guests pass over this piece of glass, sensor lights in the exhibit light up and show the rows of sharp stakes in the ground. For those of you that are not familiar with punji sticks, Marines had to watch out for this kind of sabotage. The Viet Cong dug pits like what you would see here and put sharpened stakes into the earth, carefully camouflaging the pits with leaves and branches. The trap was designed that if a Marine or soldier fell into the hole, the stakes would pierce the bottom of his boots and go into his foot. But even if the stake did not go through the boot, if a stake scratched the side of the Marine's leg, the chance for a nasty infection was high. And by placing this on the ground of our exhibit, you can visualize how easy it was for Marines to fall into the trap at any time, adding to the tension that Marines would have felt in the jungle. Now let's review what led the Marines to getting more involved in Vietnam. Aggressions in Vietnam came to a head in August 1964 as the USS Maddox was conducting intelligence collection in the Gulf of Tonkin. Intercepted messages indicated North Vietnamese Navy patrol boats were getting underway to attack the ship. The Maddox fired on the patrol boats, and the North Vietnamese patrol boats launched torpedoes but did not hit the U.S. Navy ship. From here, the story gets sketchy, with multiple reports that were later proven to be false. In Hawaii and Washington, D.C., leaders with less than accurate information reported the attacks to President Lyndon Johnson. On 7 August, Congress approved the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the president to take all measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and prevent any further aggression. The pen that you see here is one that we have in our legacy walk that was used by President Johnson to sign the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. President Johnson would use the resolution to escalate the war, including bombing targets in North Vietnam. Legacy Walk runs through our entire museum and connects all of the galleries together. More Marines were requested to deploy to Vietnam, and over May and June 1965, the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force deployed with the 3rd Marine Air Wing to Vietnam. The 3rd Marine Amphibious Force established bases at Da Nang, Phu Bai, and Chu Lai. The first major combat operation was a helicopter and amphibious assault after intelligence indicated that the 1st Viet Cong Regiment was located on the Vung Tau Peninsula. The operation was planned with much secrecy and launched while the intelligence was still fresh. By all accounts, the first major operation in Vietnam was successful. It proved the Marine Corps retained many of its capabilities developed during World War II and Korea, and confirmed the value of the tactical use of helicopters on the battlefield. In November 1966, 1 battalion base camp was established near an Army Special Forces camp at Khe Sanh. The purpose of this camp was to monitor North Vietnamese Army movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply route. During April and May 1967, the camp was attacked by North Vietnamese Army units. Here we have a short video with some details of that 159-day battle.
Some have asked what the gallantry of these Marines and airmen accomplished. Why did we choose to pay the price to defend those dreary hills? It was to be a major avenue for the enemy into populated areas and into the cities of South Vietnam. By pinning down and by decimating 2 North Vietnamese divisions, the few thousand Marines and their gallant South Vietnamese allies prevented those divisions from entering other major battles. I believe that our initiative toward talks with North Vietnam was greatly strengthened by what these men did at Khe Sanh.
Like you saw in the video, during April and May 1967, the camp was attacked by the North Vietnamese Army units. The Marines cleared hills 881 South, 881 North, and 861 that overlooked the camp. As Vietnam prepared for the Tet holidays, Khe Sanh and the surrounding bases were attacked by rockets, mortars, and artillery fire. The battle was known as the Tet Offensive, would last from 21 January until 15 April 1968. U.S. air power, artillery, and supply delivery were the lifeline until the Marines were relieved. Here you can see footage of our gallery, which shows the helicopter that supported the Marines during the Battle of Khe Sanh. This war relied heavily on the use of helicopters, and if you were to visit us in person, you could hear recordings of the memories from the veterans who fought there being played in this room. While the Battle of Khe Sanh was being fought, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units mounted sneak attacks on cities throughout South Vietnam, including Saigon, the capital, and Hue City, the cultural center of the country. In Hue City, Viet Cong soldiers infiltrated the city, and on 31 January 1968, in the early morning hours, began going door to door, murdering officers, government workers, and their families. I met a gentleman a few months ago. He was a Vietnamese boy who hid under the bed during the Tet Offensive. His family was killed, his brothers, sisters, mother, and father. He was adopted by his uncle, and they both immigrated to the United States in 1975. After being in the United States, he got his citizenship, a college education, and applied for a commission in the United States Navy. And he recently retired as a Rear Admiral. I was lucky enough to meet him on an honor flight which brings veterans to our nation's capital. Marines at Phu Bai were dispatched to Hue without intelligence on the situation in the city. In fact, they had to stop at a gas station to pick up a map. Several company leaders were left behind, expecting to be back by dinner time. The Marines did not carry the necessary food, ammunition, or supplies. Arriving from Phu Bai, the Marines fought in an urban environment they had not faced since the Battle of Seoul during the Korean War. The Marines were restricted by rules of engagement that had restricted the use of artillery, close air support, and tanks within the city to protect the cultural and historic buildings there. Due to poor weather conditions, resupply to Hue from Phu Bai and Da Nang could not be accomplished by helicopter and had to be carried out by amphibious craft on the Perfume River or by land. Eventually, leaders in the rear realized the seriousness of the situation and more Marines were ordered to Hue. Vice Premier Nguyen Thi, a Vietnamese air marshal, gave the Marines permission to ignore the rules of engagement. Along with a short window of good weather for air support, use of mortars, and artillery, the Marines were able to retake the city as the Viet Cong slipped away in the night. The city was considered liberated on February 25, 1968. President Nixon, demoralized by events of the war, announced he would not run for re-election and withdrew his name from the Democratic Party's nomination process. His successor, Richard M. Nixon, a strong anti-communist for much of the early years of the Cold War, ran on a platform that included ending the Vietnam War. In 1968 November, he won the presidency. However, instead of ending the war, he escalated it with incursions into Cambodia and Laos and renewed bombing of the North. the U.S. began withdrawing troops under Nixon's program of Vietnamization, which meant they were turning the fighting over to the South Vietnamese forces. In January 1973, Nixon announced that negotiations in Paris, France, had achieved a treaty which brought peace with honor to the United States and Vietnam. The treaty included the withdrawal of all foreign troops from Vietnam. Approximately 250 U.S. military personnel remained in Vietnam assigned to the embassy. The only problem with the treaty was that the North Vietnamese did not see themselves as foreign troops and stayed in South Vietnam to fight the Saigon government. There are stories that say Nixon promised to return U.S. troops if the North violated the treaty. However, Nixon became embroiled in the Watergate scandal and resigned the presidency in August 1974. He was replaced by Vice President Gerald R. Ford. In March 1975, the Khmer Rouge overthrew the government of Phnom Penh, Cambodia, prompting the Navy and Marine Corps to evacuate U.S. civilians and local workers from the U.S. Embassy in Phnom Penh. The actions of the Khmer Rouge created a domino effect and prompted the North Vietnamese to begin their final attack on the capital city of Saigon. In Vietnam on March 5th, the North Vietnamese Army began operations in the former I Corps, a location where the Marines operated during their time in Vietnam. The South Vietnamese military bases collapsed under the pressure of these attacks. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon arranged for the evacuation of U.S. personnel by civilian aircraft. Additionally, Vietnamese Navy ships, passenger and cargo ships, were used to evacuate the refugees. Though the plan was to be calm and orderly, it soon turned into chaos. U.S. Marines deployed to provide security and maintain order on the U.S. civilian ships that were overloaded. Marines were also deployed to supplement the Marine Security Force at the embassy. The last 2 Marines killed in action were the Marines of this unit, and they were killed in a mortar attack that was aimed to disrupt the civilian evacuation at the Saigon airport. Military, State Department, and CIA station leaders planned the final evacuation of Saigon. 7th Fleet ships, many that had participated in the Cambodian evacuation, were stationed off the coast. On 29 April, Operation Frequent Wind was executed, with Marine and Air Force helicopters flying for nearly the next 48 hours straight. It ended 49 years ago today, with the final helicopter leaving Saigon. Now just a few of my personal memories of the evacuation of Saigon. I was serving on board the USS Midway, which I'd mentioned. It's an aircraft carrier. On April 29th, we received the order to begin the evacuation. The order came just after we spotted incoming South Vietnamese Air Force helicopters loaded with civilian families wanting to land on our flight deck. Throughout the 29th and 30th, the flight deck was busy, landing both U.S. helicopters, South Vietnamese helicopters, bringing Americans and South Vietnamese refugees to the fleet. Now I'd like to tell you a special story with one of the most incredible acts of courage that day, and that's the landing of Major Buang Key's Bird Dog landing on the USS Midway. The aircraft was only designed for 2 people. It was carrying 7. It was a South Vietnamese pilot, his wife, and their 5 children trying to escape. The pilot made one pass down the flight deck and quickly returned and made a second pass. When he made the second pass, the crew on the flight deck noticed that he threw something from the window, and it turned out it was his holster. And when they opened the holster, they found the note asking for help. The note had been written on a page from his flight manual. When the note was taken to the bridge, the captain agreed to push 4 helicopters over the side to make space for him to land. The note read, "Can you move these helicopters to the other side? I can land on your runway. I can fly 1 more hour. We have enough time to move. Please rescue Major Buang, wife, and 5 child." Now I would like to show you that video of the Major landing on the Midway. He made his one and only perfect aircraft landing. After his family left the airplane, he was taken to the bridge to meet the captain, where the captain removed his gold Navy aviator wings and pinned them on the Major. President Ford ordered the last flights with the U.S. ambassador on board. The last U.S. Marine to leave Vietnam were a squad from the Marine Security Force. The 20-year conflict in Vietnam had come to a close. On 9 November 1989, the Berlin Wall, a symbol of the Cold War, was demolished. About a month later, the end of the Cold War was marked by the declaration by President George H.W. Bush and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev during a summit in Malta. The Cold War was over, but the events and conflicts that took place in this period of time have had lasting effects on the world. However, throughout the Korean War and Vietnam War conflicts, the Marines followed through with courage, honor, and commitment as the world's premier fighting force and protectors of our country, and they continue to do so today. Thank you all for attending this presentation, and I believe we have time for questions.
We do, if I was quicker on the draw and could get to the questions quicker. The first question I have is the term jarhead still used, and are Marines okay with that term?
Well, being a sailor, I still use it very often. I think it is. I think any of us that have nicknames that are attached to the service, like for the Navy, a squid, and for an airman, a zoomie, we all take it with the way that it is intended. It's actually a sign of admiration.
Another question came in early on, I think when you were talking about the Korean War. And I'll phrase it like this: answer if you can, and if you are not able to, I think we will all understand. Why did the U.S. intervene in Korea when it didn't intervene in China?
For one, under the agreement that was made at the end of World War II, that we actually had a responsibility to protect South Vietnam since we were occupying it. We had an obligation there. We didn't have that same obligation in China. There's also a lot of strategists who over the years have told or have said that we should never enter a land war in Asia. We made that mistake a couple of times. I think that the two aren't really, because in China you had an existing civil war that dates back to 1936 or so, whereas this was a new conflict. So if we were going to enter into China, it should have been in the 30s, which wouldn't have been politically or militarily correct.
Thank you. And I apologize. It appears I put you on the spot with that one,
No,
but
not really. Just took a minute to think it through.
okay. And that is all the questions I have. but I do want to share with you all of the thank yous and amazing presentation that I have in the chat box. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Suba. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hey, Dave, excellent presentation. Before I do my wrap up, could you reiterate again the landing on Midway and then what happened to that gentleman?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to find out next year.
Okay.
Actually, every 5 years, there's a reunion on board the Midway
Okay.
between the captain, who is retired now, Larry Chambers, the air boss, who is responsible for all the operations on the flight deck, Commander Vern Jumper, who actually volunteers as a docent on board the USS Midway Museum in San Diego and tells that same story when he's working as a docent. So the family and those two individuals, as part of the remembrance commemoration that they do every 5 years, meet out in San Diego. And I have plans to be in San Diego next year to meet my old captain, the air boss, and this incredible family. I do know that out of the five, one of the sons became a U.S. Air Force officer. One of the daughters became an ophthalmologist, and I'm not sure about the other three. But I've seen photographs from these reunions when they've been on board with the family, going down to the grandkids, in which there may even be great grandkids now. And it makes me reflect that wouldn't have happened if those two officers hadn't made the decision to allow them to land. And I think that was courage on the part of the major to make that one landing, because if you ever have seen film of an airplane coming in on a flight deck, it could scare the most skillful pilot that has been trained to do it, but also the courage of those two making that decision.
Yeah. So the individual who landed on the Midway, that was his wife, I assume.
Yes, that was his wife and the five children. And like I had mentioned before the start of the program, the bird dog is hanging from the ceiling at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. But
Okay.
the note is actually in the museum out on the Midway. That's their claim to fame, is they have the note.
Okay. We did have two late questions as you were speaking. Who replaced MacArthur after he was fired by Truman? I don't know that.
What if I said General Ridgway? Do you think that would be
I
correct?
think that's correct.
Yeah. Very good, Trudy. You get
I don't
bonus
know where I
points.
come up with these things, but that one I remember.
Yeah. And Trudy, I saw another question in the chat.
They're asking if there is a date associated with the reunion on the Midway. Does that occur on the same day every year?
Yes, it will be the week of the 29th and 30th.
Of April. I think we're done, Suba.
Okay.
There's one more
Alrighty.
question.
Sorry?
There's one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't see it. Oh, I got it now. What does the term gung ho actually mean? And does it come from pre-war service in China?
Yes, so going further back into Marine Corps history, there was a man named Evans Carlson. He had served during World War I in the Army and then tried to rejoin the Army after resigning to be a food salesman. The Army said he had to take a break in rank down to first lieutenant. He had been a major. So instead, he went to the Marine Corps. He joined the Marine Corps as a private, and he said he'd rather be a private in the Marine Corps than a lieutenant in the Army. he became what we call an old China hand. He had served with the China Marines several times. He had eventually had won a commission actually in the Marine Corps. And in the 30s, he was appointed to be the assistant security officer for the president's retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. There he got to be a friend of President Roosevelt and also his son, Jimmy. After that position, he was sent as a naval attaché or an observer to China to watch the civil war that was going on between the nationalists and the communists, but also by that point, the Japanese had attacked China. He actually linked up with Mao, and he marched on the Long March with the communist forces, and he really started to understand some of their philosophies, things that they didn't recognize a rank system. And one of the things that the Chinese said was gung ho, and it roughly translates to mean work together. He came back to the United States. He actually left the Marine Corps for a short time, but then came back just about a year before World War II started for the Americans. And in 1940 is when he came back on active duty. And he and Jimmy Roosevelt and Winston Churchill convinced FDR and the Commandant to create a commando unit similar to the Royal Commandos. And what the Marines created was the Marine Raiders. And Evans Carlson used the term gung ho, or work together, as the motto for the Marine Raiders. And we do have an exhibit in our World War II area about the Raiders and about Evans Carlson.
We got one more, Trudy.
I got one more. I didn't know if you
Yeah,
saw
we'll
that.
wrap up with this after this one.
Okay. What is the relationship between the Marine Corps as it relates to the US Navy?
So we're going to go way back in time when we first started, and when two ships would come into combat, they would be very close to each other. And you needed snipers that would climb up into the rigging and fire down onto the sailors on the opposing ship. Those were Marines. They were also placed in charge of protecting the shipyards that were in Philadelphia and Boston, New York. So the Marines were an integral part of the Navy. The Navy was established in October of 1775, and the Marine Corps was established in November 10th. Now, over the years, the mission has changed. The Marines have become more of the amphibious force than what they originally were tasked with doing, of fighting with the ship. Though we still do have Marines who serve on some ships, the amphibious ships, they don't serve on board the ships as they did even in the Vietnam era, where they provided security for the magazines where the weapons were stored, and also did some honorary functions like being an orderly to the commanding officer or the general. But we are two separate services, with the Marine Corps serving under a 4-star general, the Commandant, and the Navy serving under the Chief of Naval Operations, a 4-star admiral, both of who then report to the Secretary of the Navy. I hope that answers it in a short way.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I think the Navy provides the medical support, Dave, for the Marine Corps.
That's very true. The Navy does supply corpsmen, doctors, dentists, chaplains, and religious program specialists to support those areas. and those are well represented at the museum here.
Well, thank you, Dave. On behalf of ARP Virginia, I really want to thank you. I learned some new things, and I've been to the museum many times. I would highly encourage everyone to go to the museum. I saw a comment in the chat that she goes by I-95 and has time or whatever to stop by I-95. And I said, be sure to pull off, go to the museum. There's free ample parking. And docents like you just do a fantastic job there.
We hear that comment often when people stop in. We are open every day except for Christmas and Thanksgiving.
Wow. Yeah. I talked to my friends who are in the local area that haven't been there yet. I said, shame on you. So anyway, I always try to shame them into going and saying, you got to go there. We'd love to get your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programs. So you'll be receiving a follow-up email with a link to a survey. Our Tuesday Explorers bonus, it normally ends in April, but we have a bonus one next week. Amber's already put that in the link. It's a presentation on Galapagos. So it's the final one for the season. So like I said, a bonus one. In the chat box, you'll see a link to register for next week's program. Until next time, we encourage you to stay curious, keep exploring. Once again, our thanks to the Marine Corps Museum and Gloria, Dave, all the wonderful people there who make this presentation possible. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.